Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we will be talking about episode 5 of season 3 of His Dark Materials, No Way Out. Things have really heated up in the last few episodes and I feel like everyone is finally on the scene. This is the first episode where we really see a lot about Mary and her journey. She's finally reached her destination, so let's dive in and talk about that. Mary encounters a strange creature that we come to learn is called a Mulefa, and she very gamely decides to follow this Mulefa back to its home. There, Mary really flourishes. We see her immerse herself in this Mulefa society, learn about their customs, their ways. We even get a lot about Mary learning the Mulefa language in this episode, and as someone who has taught language quite a bit in foreign countries, I really loved how they showed this process of language acquisition. It was definitely much faster than I think is realistic, but I thought this gradual filling in of the blanks from context was really spot on. In the Mulefa village, Mary makes friends with one particular Mulefa named Atal, and Atal shows Mary the seed pods that are incredibly important in the Mulefa culture. They fall from these giant trees that the Mulefa live under, and the Mulefa use these seed pods to travel. They're basically roller skates, if you will. The one thing that I really wish we'd been able to spend more time on, and I understand a lot happened in this season, was learning about the cooperative nature of the Mulefa society. One of the more interesting things about the Mulefa society, in my opinion, in the book, was that the Mulefa were forced to work cooperatively based on their biology. They didn't have opposable thumbs, so in order to do tasks like tie fishing ropes, they had to work in pairs, and Mary is kind of the odd woman out since she can do those tasks alone. They really appreciate her efficiency, but she realizes that she's missing the social contact that the Mulefa are so accustomed to and is so baked into how they conduct themselves. I thought there were some lessons to be learned in how Philip Pullman portrays that more cooperative style culture. As Mary spends more time with Atal and the other Mulefas, she starts to really understand how important the seed pods are in their society and in their biology, to be honest. She learns about the word sraf in Mulefa, that sraf is connected to the seed pods, and Atal tasks her with finding out where the sraf is going. The seed pod trees that are a foundational piece of the Mulefa ecosystem are dying, and without the seed pod trees and the seed pod oil, this means that the Mulefa are dying, and they're really asking Mary to help them figure out how they can stop this catastrophe. Mary is a scientist. They also see her as a foreigner, someone who probably came with a purpose. The Mulefa are able to see the sraf by themselves without any assistance. At this point, Mary cannot, so the first step in Mary helping them is to figure out how she can see sraf as well. In a very different world, the kids have finally arrived in the land of the dead proper, and we see that the terrain is not made of mountain or rock, it's actually made of trash. I thought this was genius and also some not so subtle criticism on our culture of consumerism. You know, we always say like, oh, you better spend your money while you're alive, you can't take it with you. And I think this is kind of an answer to what if you could. You would be literally buried in junk, and this is what the ghosts spend eternity facing. Love it. Interesting commentary. Not long after they arrive, the kids meet some ghosts, and Lyra asks them if they could potentially help her find Roger. The world seems vast. It also seems strangely empty, so it's going to take some work to find this one particular kid. I liked this depiction of the land of the dead, but it is very different from the one portrayed in the book. I thought it kind of skipped over a lot of the misery that Philip Pullman describes. In the book, the Galavespians also accompany the kids in the land of the dead, and again, they ride these very bright dragonflies, and Philip Pullman describes the dragonflies as the brightest colored things in the land of the dead, so the ghosts are kind of drawn to this beauty that they have we don't see any of that, but in the show, the ghosts are very pale. They're wearing these very shabby, various tones of beige and gray and brown clothes, and it just seems like the light has seeped out of the world. The land of the dead that we see doesn't have any hellfire, it doesn't have any physical punishment, no torment, none of the things that we might associate with a classic depiction of hell. With that said, Lyra is tormented by a fake version of Pan who she follows around the land of the dead and tries to convince her that she's only here out of guilt and to play the hero. Lyra is very good at playing the hero, and it's something she's done multiple times already, so this really stings. We find out that this is the punishment that the Harpies extend to the ghosts, whether they've been good or bad. This is really the eternal torment that all who die face. Just their worst possible negative thoughts absorbing them with no break whatsoever. After Lyra shakes off this fake tormenting Pan, she actually does find Roger, and it's a bit of an anticlimactic moment. Roger does not seem thrilled to see Lyra, even though Lyra is so excited, and it feels like he's lost all hope. He's convinced that she cannot help him, that there is no getting out of this situation, and that she shouldn't have come. But he does seem very clear that his death was not her fault. I liked this moment. I thought it was very realistic and, you know, if this were a real situation, how it might go. The one thing that kind of spoiled it for me just a tiny bit was how much Roger has aged. And of course, the actor who portrays Roger has grown up. It's been God knows how many years at this point. But I'm just so used to seeing Roger as a very young, very small boy, and all of a sudden he's like, you know, at least an older teenager. So I thought that was funny, but willing suspension of disbelief and all that. Roger seems to immediately distance himself a little bit when Lyra introduces Will to him. It feels like there's this strange kind of competitive adversarial nature between the two of them. It felt right to me that they were a tiny bit jealous of each other. In any case, Will is very optimistic. He has not lost hope yet, and he's not quite as dismayed about the situation as Lyra is. He really wants to help Roger in any way he can, and he persuades Lyra to keep trying. This is worse than prison. This is worse than they could have even imagined. And they realize they've come all this way, they have to do something. And this gives Lyra the idea that maybe they can somehow free the ghosts, and maybe they can do that by cutting a window out of the land of the dead, so at least the ghosts can travel somewhere else and they're not trapped in these mountains of junk with these harpies tormenting them emotionally and mentally for all of eternity. The only problem is that when they first try this, they're not able to cut into anything. Will tries his knife and realizes that he's hitting something like rock whenever he tries to cut, and Lyra instinctively seems to know that they're too far down. Physically, they need to be higher to cut into anywhere that isn't completely underground. So this will mean some kind of journey higher in the land of the dead. As the kids are hatching this plan to find somewhere higher and create this window, the harpies appear in earnest, and they start feeding the kids this negativity, all of these horrible ruminations about all the things that they've done poorly in their life. Will starts thinking about his mother, and all the guilt about abandoning her comes up. The harpies are not going to make this easy. With that said, the depiction of the harpies, I loved their physical characteristics in the show. They're truly ugly, and I love that the show went there. Though I think they're uglier than I thought they would be. I had more of a classical Greek depiction of a harpy in mind. In the book, they're physically a bit more of a threat than they are in the show. Back at Magisterium headquarters in Geneva, Mrs. Coulter is being held a prisoner. As I mentioned in the last episode, she's wearing a blue dress that reminds me strongly of the uniforms that the kids wore at Bolvangar, and I think that is a message to us that she is no longer in a position of power, and she's really at the mercy of the Magisterium here. We are also reminded that she has been split up from the Golden Monkey Demon, who is currently hanging out in a cage with Father MacPhail. There is a strange scene in this episode where Father MacPhail is looking at the golden monkey, who's looking back at him, and he gradually reaches his hand toward the golden monkey as if he's about to touch the golden monkey. We know from previous episodes that any kind of physical contact between a human and someone else's demon is deeply taboo in the culture that we see in his dark materials. It is very much not allowed, and it is a tremendous violation of bodily autonomy, but also someone's maybe spiritual autonomy as well. So this move by Father MacPhail is deeply, deeply problematic. He is being observed, though. He doesn't know this at first. Father Gomez watches him get closer and closer to the golden monkey and then chides Father MacPhail, warns Father MacPhail, reminds Father MacPhail that this kind of contact is forbidden. For me, this was a sign that the seed that Mrs. Coulter planted at the end of the last episode about the magisterium being more interested in power than truth had kind of taken root in Father Gomez's psyche. I think it woke him up to the fact that Father MacPhail, though he is the leader of the magisterium, might not be such a morally spotless person as Father Gomez had first imagined that he was. Father President doesn't take kindly to being questioned by Father Gomez, and he slaps him across the face and essentially tells him to get the fuck out of here. He will not tolerate any kind of disobedience or doubt from Father Gomez. Father Gomez has no place to criticize Father MacPhail, and he's really done with him, doesn't want to see him anymore. This puts Father Gomez in an interesting and kind of perilous place for such a pious and devoted servant to the magisterium. He just pissed off the highest officer of the magisterium, whom I'm guessing he believes has some contact with the authority, though that's not really talked about. And so he figures out that an interesting and perhaps effective way of making amends and redeeming himself is offering up himself for a task. So we see Father Gomez go to Father President, Father MacPhail, and offer to track down the serpent that they've all heard so much about in the prophecy about Lyra. They haven't had any success locating Lyra, but will they even need to if they can find the serpent himself, herself, we know it's a herself in this case, and take her out so that the temptation cannot occur to begin with? Father MacPhail agrees to this. Immediately after we hear about Father Gomez's plan to track down the serpent, we cut to Mary in the Mulefa world, and she is in, I think, like a river or a creek, and she spots a large hunk of amber in the water, and this is how we eventually get to the idea of the Amber Spyglass. I have to admit, I did not care for this, though I understand, again, there are probably lots of time constraints, budgetary constraints, but the Amber Spyglass in the show is not a spyglass at all, and we don't get any of the process of Mary and the Mulefa making the spyglass or even making the amber lacquered lens that becomes the spyglass. She just finds these huge discs of amber and eventually finds one that will suit her needs, and that is how she comes to see Sroff. The one detail that they did include was that in order to be able to use the amber, she has to dip her finger in the oil from the seed pods, covering the amber in that oil, and it's really the oil and the amber in tandem that help her see Sroff and recognize that yes, Sroff is dust. Sroff is dust, and Sroff is leaving the world, and that is why the trees are dying. Back in the land of the dead, there is a beautiful scene where Lyra and Roger are talking. Lyra discovers that Roger doesn't really remember his life in Oxford, so she begins to describe all of her shenanigans, their play that they had together, their exploration of Jordan College, and we see as Lyra tells these stories to Roger of their life together that she's bringing almost literal light into the land of the dead. Roger's face brightens up and some color returns to him, and it's almost as though these memories are giving him life beyond life. And he's not alone. As Lyra tells these stories, we see that all of the other ghosts in the land of the dead are crowding around the kids so that they can listen, because it's reminding them of their own lives that they lived. Lyra's stories are quite powerful, and she uses that rapport that she builds with the ghosts to tell them about their plans to leave the land of the dead. Some of the ghosts are not convinced though, and they want to know what will happen once they potentially step through that window into another world. And that's a fair question. None of them have ever seen it done before because it never has been done before, and they're not clear on what's next. What could a next eternity possibly look like? One ghost in particular, portrayed in the show as an older woman, pipes up and talks about the futility of living her life in the anticipation of heaven, or at least in the avoidance of hell. And she gives this really moving speech that was a smaller portion of the speech the similar character in the book gave. I think this is one of the most crucial passages in the Amber Spyglass and probably in his Dark Materials, so it is yet another one that I want to read and really give pause to. So let's do that. Those who had seen how demons dissolved were remembering it, and those who hadn't were imagining it, and no one spoke until a young woman came forward. She had died as a martyr centuries before. She looked around and said to the other ghosts, "When we were alive, they told us that when we died, we'd go to heaven. And they said that heaven was a place of joy and glory, and we would spend eternity in the company of saints and angels, praising the Almighty in a state of bliss." That's what they said. And that's what led some of us to give our lives, and others to spend years in solitary prayer, while all the joy of life was going to waste around us, and we never knew. Because the land of the dead isn't a place of reward or a place of punishment. It's a place of nothing. The good come here as well as the wicked, and all of us languish in this gloom forever, with no hope of freedom, or joy, or sleep, or rest, or peace. But now this child has come offering us a way out, and I'm going to follow her. Even if it means oblivion, friends, I'll welcome it because it won't be nothing. We'll be alive again in 1,000 blades of grass and 1,000,000 leaves. We'll be falling in the raindrops and blowing in the fresh breeze. We'll be glittering in the dew under the stars and the moon out there in the physical world, which is our true home and always was. So I urge you, come with the child out to the sky. I feel really moved by how much Philip Pullman relishes and enjoys and appreciates the very visceral experience we have as humans. Lyra realizes that the stories that she's telling the ghosts, the true stories that she's telling them about her life, are really nourishing them. And the ghosts aren't the only ones listening to her. The harpies also seem to be listening to her tell these stories, and they are no longer tormenting the people. Their attention has been redirected to living in Lyra's stories instead, as long as they're true. Again, this is a pretty big divergence from the book. One of the main scenes that occurs in the book is when Lyra decides to tell the ghosts a very elaborate, very false story about her involving pirates, her parents who are royalty somehow, a shipwreck, all of these things, complete nonsense. But she's such a good storyteller that it is really fun to listen to, and it comes so naturally to her. Storytelling is one of her greatest gifts, and it's gotten her so far in the book. However, the stories are relatively meaningless in the eyes of the harpies, and No Name, the main harpy, cannot tolerate her telling these lies, and she swoops down at Lyra to threaten her physically, and perhaps by mistake, perhaps not, it's never super certain in the book. She ends up taking a clump out of Lyra's hair with her claws. Cat transit. And Lyra is very spooked by this, and it kind of is the tipping point in her career as a liar. There's this following scene where the harpies are screaming, liar, 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 and that word liar is echoing throughout the land of the dead, and it sounds as though they're saying Lyra. This should have been a cue to me when I first read the book that her name was pronounced Lyra, but I wasn't reading this out loud, so there you have it. In any case, this is what turns Lyra from her career as a world-class liar, and she kind of devotes herself to telling the truth. One of the stories that we hear Lyra telling the ghosts features Lee Scoresby quite heavily, and she mentions that Lee is the only adult she ever really trusted, which is kind of heartbreaking. Not long after that, though, Lee himself appears, and though if you've seen any of my videos from season 1 or season 2, you know I'm not a big Lin-Manuel Miranda fan for Lee. I was quite happy to see him here. It was a nice cameo. He brings a lot of energy wherever he goes, and it's a very sweet reunion to see Lyra and Lee together again. Hearing Lyra say that Lee was the only adult she ever trusted helped me realize that Lee died for her. Lee absolutely chose to sacrifice his own life for Lyra, and I think he's one of the few characters we see do this so actively, at least at this point. In Geneva again, Mrs. Coulter is escorted from her room to the lab so that the Magisterium can use the connection Mrs. Coulter has to her golden monkey demon to detonate the bomb that they have pointed towards Lyra with the remaining hair that they have. They will harness the energy that they use from severing the two of them to power the bomb. Mrs. Coulter is pretty desperate at this point, and in that desperation, she decides to lean very heavily on her relationship with Dr. Cooper. She talks to Dr. Cooper about the Magisterium's many faults, how they have gone way, way too far, and how this is essentially a morally bankrupt organization at this point. She points to the fact that the Magisterium uses people until they're no longer needed, which is what is happening to her, and she warns Dr. Cooper that Dr. Cooper might be next. I thought this was a pretty interesting conversation because Dr. Cooper and Mrs. Coulter are both fiercely intelligent women who have been working for this organization that chronically underestimates and undervalues them. Father MacPhail enters the lab at some point and seems almost ecstatic about the possibility of this project moving forward. He seems almost in a state of rapture. He is so excited, and he makes a comment about the divine precision of the bomb. And I kind of rolled my eyes when he said that, because this isn't divine precision. The precision has been thought about, designed, and constructed by the very woman standing next to him, Dr. Cooper, who is not divine herself. The pleading that Mrs. Coulter does with Dr. Cooper when she enters the lab eventually works, and Dr. Cooper stops this bomb detonation from going off at the very last possible moment. She has a change of heart, and when Father MacPhail sees that Dr. Cooper is interfering, he is irate. Father MacPhail has not come this far to see this experiment fail, and so rather than negotiate with her or put off this bomb detonation, he ends up killing Dr. Cooper, which is pretty upsetting. At around the same time, Lord Roke springs into action. He's been following the scene all this time. He frees the golden monkey demon from the cage, and the golden monkey in turn helps Mrs. Coulter free herself. Father MacPhail is not going to back down now though, and to prevent himself from being stung by Lord Roke's spurs, he crushes Lord Roke and ends up killing him. Mrs. Coulter and Father MacPhail get into it, and Father MacPhail tries to choke Mrs. Coulter while Mrs. Coulter relies on her mystery slap fight technique that I've been trying to research without any success. She is not going down without a fight, and she will certainly not let Father MacPhail kill her daughter if she can help it. Mrs. Coulter even bites Father MacPhail. That is how serious she is. Mrs. Coulter tries her damnedest to deactivate the bomb by taking it apart, but Father MacPhail takes matters into his own hands, and he straps himself into the chair where Mrs. Coulter had been sitting beforehand. His gecko demon, I'm guessing, whatever kind of lizard she might be, slithers into the cage where the golden monkey had been, and we realize that he is willing to sacrifice himself to get the job done, which is insane, but the definition of a martyr for him, so it does make sense. Mrs. Coulter is able to successfully stop the bomb. She physically takes it apart so that it cannot go off at, of course, the last second possible. But just as that happens, we hear a booming voice and the light shines upon the magisterium, and we realize that the authority, Metatron, actually his regent, is speaking to her, to Father MacPhail, to everyone, and he is intervening in human affairs. I didn't talk about this, but Alarbus, who Lord Asriel theoretically blew up into a million parts and who is blasted back to the authority, does tell the authority what Asriel is up to, warns the authority, Metatron, about all of the happenings of the Republic of Heaven, and Asriel gets the attention of Metatron. Metatron finally learns his name, and to retaliate against that effort, Metatron intervenes, detonating the bomb even without it being properly put together, and oh shit, this bomb is about to go off. The Magisterium's bomb, detonated by the Regent Metatron himself, does find the land of the dead and blows up. However, it misses Lyra. I understand why they made this divergence from how this goes down in the book, but I thought what happened in the book with the bomb was a bit more interesting. In the book, John Perry and Lee kind of come together as ghosts, and John Perry is the real VIP of the situation. He communicates to the kids that he knows that a bomb has been worked on to find Lyra, and he also knows that they're using Lyra's cut hair to focus the bomb. His solution to this problem is to direct Will to use the knife, find the patch of hair that has been cut short, and to actually remove any of the remaining bits of that hair. So they cut Lyra's hair down to the scalp, and Will is instructed to open a window into another world where there's just rock and put that hair, that little wisp of hair that's left, into that other world, close the window so that the bomb actually finds rock in another world and doesn't come to the land of the dead. This happens successfully in the nick of time, so the kids are not hurt, but an abyss does form. It's only by the skin of their teeth and John Perry's major shaman abilities that they avoid complete oblivion. This blast of the bomb is really where the episode ends. Is Lyra alive? Is Mrs. Coulter alive? What happened to the Magisterium? Is the building on fire? Lots of questions to answer in episode 6. Thank you again so much for watching. Bye.